Chapter 13. We could not have been more wrong about our first trip south to the eastern mountains of the continent. We traveled the foothills of those mountains for a month after the long journey there and encountered not one soul. We saw evidence of Indian tribes, but were careful to avoid contact. The trapping was excellent, and my education as a fur trapper continued. The lands we encountered inspired a peace in me never felt before. The rolling hills and raging streams that flowed from the eastern mountains strangely inspired a feeling of welcome. The belief that this would be, or was supposed to be, home grew with each passing day. Once as a child, my brother Micah and I were learning to hunt deep in the woods from my father. Father came to a clearing and stopped. He looked up into the high pine, oak, and maple trees that surrounded us. Staring up and slowly spinning, he instructed us to listen carefully. "Do you hear it?" he asked in a pleading tone. "Do either of you?" He continued, almost desperate now, as he still looked skyward. I snuck a peek from the corner of one eye at Micah, who stood next to Father, staring upward with a look of recognition. Father continued, "As a boy in England, I stood in several great churches and looked up at the high ceilings with the beautiful artwork all around and heard music. That's the closest to heaven I have ever felt. But sometimes when the woods are still and quiet, and I look up at the beauty of God's creation here in the deep woods, I hear that same music and feel close to heaven, like in those childhood moments." As soon as he paused, my brother burst in. "I hear it, Father!" he exclaimed excitedly. I heard nothing. To please Father, I echoed my brother's words. Traveling with Jean-Luc and Claude through these unsettled lands, the urge to stop frequently and look up was uncontrollable. I heard music, and it was beautiful. Instinctively, I knew this was home. The return trip to the mission was equally peaceful. We all agreed long before returning to the mission that we would be heading back to the southern mountains again in the spring. The last couple of weeks before reaching the mission turned dreadfully cold. The excitement that arose in me as we laid our eyes on our winter home was barely containable. Just as quickly an eerie coldness began to engulf my limbs, producing a tingly sensation. The feel of blood flowing through a network of veins was recognizable as the chills led to uncontrollable shudders seizing my body. The first warning sign was the absence of the smoke from fires I had seen the first time we approached the mission. Second, there were no guards, and the large gate was open with the wooden door splintered. I could see the cross of the church rising above the settlement walls, and there was a large black bird sitting ominously on top of the cross. Before we even stepped inside, there was a perceivable odor and strange sounds that indicated something was wrong. The smell of death filled the air. The cackle of birds and the snarling of some predators were audible as we came near the door. Even the most hardened men could not have been prepared for the grisly sight we stepped into. Flashbacks of the dead Wyandotte on the canoes a year earlier immediately raced into my mind. Surveying the interior of the mission, there were rotting, decaying, half-eaten corpses everywhere. The Frenchmen we had stayed with, the holy men my companions had held conference with, and members of the Wyandotte deer clan lay dead and scattered. Coyotes and wild dogs fought for scraps of flesh, and ravenous crows sat perched all over, pecking at the desecrated bodies. Most of the buildings had been at least partially burned. Upon inspection, it became clear another Native American tribe had slaughtered them. Most bodies were littered with arrows or had skulls that had been crushed by either a club or a tomahawk. A few of the priests had been tied to posts in front of the church and burned to death. Their blackened, charred bodies were crumpled at the base of each post, falling only after the ropes that held them had burnt. They were likely burned in protest of the changes they tried to impose on the Native Americans of the region. A flood of emotions overwhelmed the three of us. We were devastated by the savagery of the attack, the loss of anticipated companions, and the recognition of the new challenges we'd face. The next several days were spent silently cleaning up the massacre. The bodies were buried, gate repaired, and most of the buildings demolished to acquire enough salvageable materials to repair and rebuild the least damaged shelter. We searched the mission and the nearby fields for any food that had not been taken or destroyed. It was not a shock that very little had been left behind by the raiders. Immediate efforts to fish and hunt began. Results were poor due to the previous onset of cold weather. We dried the little meat we acquired before the arrival of full winter. The winter was difficult, but we proved resourceful enough to survive. Never before had I experienced the pangs of hunger to such a degree. The spasms of pain that grip your stomach due to lack of food were nearly unbearable at times. As months passed, the situation grew more desperate. By late winter, Claude and Jean-Luc began to collect tree bark and insist we all chew on bark and leather clothing for several hours each day. We spent long days repairing traps, making new clothing, and inventing projects to distract from the pains brought by hunger. We retold stories that by the end of winter all three could now recite word for word. Claude religiously carved markings onto the wall of the shelter to represent each day. We anxiously awaited any sign of spring. Much time was spent debating new plans for the coming season. We needed to travel either north or west to trade the furs we had trapped. Certain supplies were necessary to head back to the southeastern mountains. Claude and Jean-Luc knew where to go, but were fearful of finding only devastation or deserted villages. Even our Bear Clan companions from the previous winter had uprooted and moved northeast. It was very likely this was a practice being copied by other clans and villages. In the end, come spring, we agreed to head west because it didn't take us far out of the intended path. This decision proved to be extremely lucky. The weather finally broke. After traveling northwest only one day out of the way, we encountered a group of Wyandotte Wolf Clan migrating northeast to escape Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, raids. The same decision the Bear Clan had made the previous spring. They were able to provide for most of our needs through trade. For a day, stories were exchanged between our two groups. The increasing violence and aggression of the rival Indians dominated the talks. The next day, resupplied and rejuvenated, we walked anxiously away from the Wolf Clan party to resume our journey. The southeastern mountains were the desired destination.